of the affirming team. Ordinarily, I would share my timer on my screen. I'm wondering if it's best not to do that with recording. So if people wouldn't mind timing themselves, that would probably be ideal.
All right, just double checking that I'm audible before I start.
Yeah, you're audible.
All right, in that case, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The norm to reduce your reliance on external validation may be a norm that sounds good in theory, but in practice, it is often unsuccessfully applied and leads to people indulging in a range of different vice activities or incredibly regressive and chauvinistic attitudes. And that is why we regret this narrative in self-help. I'm going to start this speech by making the argument that validation is often something which is healthy. And for that reason and that reason alone, we ought not support a norm that pushes people away from seeking external validation from others. The starting point for this argument is simply that when you feel validated by other people, that is something which produces good feelings within you. Makes you feel nice, feel validated, feel a serotonin hit. And I understand this is a very simple argument, but it is also a very effective one. Because replicated en masse, this is the sort of thing that leads to people feeling far happier lives. Additionally, we would say that there are reasons why the people that you care the most about, people you seek validation from, are also people that are going to validate you in very healthy ways. It's often your parents, your peers, people that are friends, or people you have a relationship with that care about you, understand how to communicate to you, and are likely to validate you in very constructive ways. Thirdly, though, we would say, regardless of whether or not this produces a serotonin hit, it also is just a good narrative because it produces socially optimal behavior. The number of people that, for example, would never want to give away money, but in the presence of others are likely to do things like donate money to charity or donate to a homeless person they see on the street because they seek the serotonin hit that external validation from others around them gives them, is really important for making sure that a lot of these social justice issues have backing and support behind them. Second argument then, even if it isn't the case that validation is always or on average a good thing, we would say this norm is one which is applied in a way which leads people down a rabbit hole of incredibly regressive behavior. And I'm talking about the Jordan Peterson, hyper-masculine self-help gurus that push people down the rabbit hole of being an MRA, being a MGTOW, and engaging in incredibly chauvinistic or racist behavior. Obviously, this argument is sufficient for us to win the debate on side affirmative because of the scale of impact. There are literally millions of people around the world that have opted into this narrative that associate with incredibly chauvinistic, attitudes towards women and towards racial minorities because they've opted into this type of self-help that has been communicated to them from these self-help gurus. The first thing that I would like to say under this line of argument is that even if this is a norm which is applied without, people with bad motives that want people to become ideologically regressive, naturally it pushes people to become incredibly chauvinistic because it is a norm that excuses offending others. Because often the way people interpret this is, well, if I engage in sexist behavior, if I catcall somebody, or if I use a racial slur, that's not something I should not worry about others being, for example, offended by that. I should instead feel, well, they're weak and they're people that I should not care about the opinion of, because you have internalized this norm of not liking validation. The second thing I would say, though, is that when you reject others' validation, this can also just lead to people rejecting others entirely because of the way that the norm is written in a way that makes people feel as if they all reject what others feel about them. I think this is really important because it means that people just engage in a lot of antisocial behaviors and attitudes. If there are people that have, large friend groups in high school, for example, they're likely to, as they become an adult, opt into these types of narratives and feel, maybe I should adopt a really, antisocial Wall Street bet style, like day trading kind of antisocial behavior, because they've opted into the idea that even though these are types of lifestyles which typically are frowned upon, at the point where now you can feel, well, I can excuse this because there is a norm that I have implied for myself about rejecting external validation, you're now far more likely to go down those rabbit holes as well. Thirdly, we also think that this aligns with existing and other norms of rugged individualism, which align with hypermasculine behaviors. There are plenty of people that are like, dating gurus and self-help gurus that push norms that men specifically ought be incredibly, individual or be incredibly masculine. I think this ties in very nicely to the idea that you ought reject others and reject external validation because of how similar the ideas of rugged individualism and rejecting validation are. The sum total of all of this argumentation is this is a norm which has increased the number of chauvinistic and racist attitudes in society tremendously. Third argument. Even if that wasn't the case, we also would posit that self-help tends to be accessed with people that are particularly vulnerable, that maybe have, for example, self-esteem issues, or other external factors that push them towards accessing self-help. And this is a norm which, particularly for this group of people, which is also the group of people most likely to engage in this narrative and take it in, is particularly bad. Firstly, because it is likely to mean, that at the point you are engaging in toxic or the self-destructive behaviors, like for example, people that have a slot machine addiction or take drugs or that are addictive and harmful to them, at the point where otherwise they would have friend groups and support networks that say that is bad behavior you want to opt out of, at the point where you can now shirk the idea that you should care about what other people think, means you are far less able to access those support networks. Secondly, though, even if you are able to access support networks, you are now likely to engage with it far less constructively. For example, at the point you go to therapy, often therapists are very confronting in the way they talk to you. They make you examine things that are issues with yourself, vice activities and behaviors that you engage in. At the point where you can say, oh, that's just somebody else that doesn't accept who I am, that is the point that therapy ceases to work. And this is something that is very, very harmful for people getting out of poor mental states as well. Obviously, this is sufficient for us to win the debate on side affirmative because of the vulnerability of the actor that we're talking about. People that, by and large, are individuals that have existing mental health issues, that have existing vice activities that are destructive for them. We think this is sufficient for us to win the debate. But next argument, even if it wasn't the case that this had all of these problems regarding minority groups, even if it is the case that we take the best possible scenario for side negative, which is, well, maybe we should all feel like we don't need to be tied to other people. I think it just is true that there are harms when you don't get validated by others. You are less able to function in society. You have less options available to you. And this is something which is particularly bad for example, members of the LGBT+ movement. So for example, take somebody that is in a particularly conservative household. Often there are instances where people are previously closeted because they fear rejection from their family. And at the point they internalize this narrative of, well, you should not care about what others think about you, that is the point in time when you are likely to be incredibly risk-taking and do things like out yourself prematurely and face the consequences of your family rejecting you, putting you out on the street, and the worst sort of consequences that can come of that. It is obviously unfortunate and not something which we are happy about, but it is reality for many people. And we would say that discouraging that sort of behavior is something which we ought to do on side affirmative. But notably, this isn't just an argument that applies narrowly to members of the LGBT+ movement. We would also say there are likely to be a broad set of instances where this is likely to apply. So for example, individuals that have, particular, like different idiosyncrasies that express those in society are likely to feel, as though they have trouble finding friend groups or peers and support networks broadly because they are seen not to fit in. At the end of this point, at the end of this speech, we have given you a series of reasons to believe this is likely to be not just a bad norm, one of the worst single messages to ever come out this crazy self-help craze. Could not be prouder to propose.
Cool. I thank the speaker for their speech and welcome forward the first negative speaker.
One moment, please. Can I be heard?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. I want to open this speech with 2 small observations about the human condition. The first is that humans are naturally social creatures and naturally want and seek the approval of others. And the second is that from a very young age, we're all of our parents and all of the educational institutions that formed us directed our behavior through either giving or taking away external validation. Now, given that context, a human context, we all each day crave validation for the reasons that first affirmative gives you. The question that faces you in this debate is this: is it really that plausible that the people who need self-help need it because they do not want validation enough? Or alternatively, is it really true that there's this large surplus of people who, don't want validation very much and therefore treat others badly because of it? The first thing I'll do in this speech is one piece of rebuttal, then some setup, and then two arguments. First piece of rebuttal. A key push from side Affirmative is that this the narrative that encourages you not to care about the validation of others enables you to treat others poorly. We would point out that you treat others poorly and you, for example, engage in chauvinistic behavior because you have a desire to feel powerful, you have a desire to feel insecurity. We think people who are chauvinists under their side are very likely to be chauvinists under our side. And we think that's particularly true in the context of protecting like male honor, right? And the reason for that is the reason those guys do what they do and pretend to be really tough men is not like because they go, I know this might cost me some social validation, but I really want to feel this way. It's because they believe that being seen as a real man is the path to getting the external validation and the respect that they crave. Like the guys who want to be seen as the tough dudes who watch the Jordan Peterson videos, they are some of the neediest people on the planet. And it's for that reason that, in fact, they would probably benefit from being told, and maybe the exact form of that message could differ based on their preferences, but they probably benefit from being told you don't need the validation of others. You shouldn't need to be perceived in that particular way. First thing I'm going to do in this debate is, after that, is just a bit of setup. Firstly, obviously people engage with this narrative in different ways and different degrees of intensity, right? We think, on one end of the spectrum, you've got someone who might see this narrative occasionally on their Instagram, and you've got another end of the spectrum, someone who's really deeply invested in kind of this, removing of the shackles type thing, and they're, reading a lot of books about this sort of stuff. We think that scale is super important because it indicates that people can kind of titrate how much they want to be involved with the narrative. They can opt out of it almost completely. They can block those things on Instagram, etc., or then get really, really involved, depending on whether or not it works for them. And we'd also point out this, even though the set of people who need self-help at any one moment of time maybe isn't like the majority of the population, or it could be, I suppose, but the point is that everyone at different times in their life often requires self-help, which means that the set of people who might be affected by this narrative is probably quite large. Firstly then, first argument, why is this one of the best ways to help people? Obviously, with the context here being, as I framed in the introduction, your upbringing makes you really attuned to wants external validation. The first problem with external validation is that it is out of your control, right? It is external and it is therefore quite unpredictable. And importantly, right, the metrics by which a validation is allotted within society are often quite arbitrary. They might, for example, our validation might be given based on the type of body you have, based on whether you're like an intelligent person, based on whether, your position in a variety of race or gender hierarchies. And therefore, it's quite bad to like build in your kind of as a core part of your, a core part of your being, this desire for external validation too much, because of course you don't actually, you can't actually control that. The second thing we point out is that self-validation or external validation often directs you against or can direct you against your own self-interest, right? So the people who dole out external validation are others, and they do not necessarily share their interests. In fact, they tend to be the socially powerful, right? They tend to be people who, for capitalistic reasons, or have more social power than you, people who are social climbers, right? Who just have a bit more social cachet. They're the ones who can dole out the largest amounts of validation because they're seen as higher status and that matters more to you. And therefore, there are kind of some bad dynamics can be promoted here. And in particular, I want to point to the way in which people can be exploited by their need for validation, right? Like a really common tactic that you might see is, someone who's quite a bit more socially canny, maybe making someone feel quite bad about themselves. And then, that person's response to being made feel bad about is to chase the validation of the person who made them feel better, right? Like it's often how a lot of kind of like, like stuff that's on the borderline of almost abusive relationships kind of start. Or one of the places where they often build a lot of traction is where one person in the relationship kind of withholds validation. The other person's constantly chasing it. And the hoops you have to jump through to get access to the validation often are just really difficult for you. And I want to kind of contrast that to the benefit or the sort of claim that Affirmative makes, where they're just like, well, validation is really good. And when you receive it, it's great. And that's true. It is when you receive it. It does feel nice to get that pat on the back or to get that smile. The problem is people know that, or certain people, not everyone in society, but certain people I think know that, and they can withhold that, and they can use the promise of that, and they know the fact that you crave it and you want it, and then it can make you do all kinds of things that might actually be against your self-interest. So all of the benefits that side Affirmative identifies to why validation can be valuable explains exactly why individuals are vulnerable to being manipulated under our side. Third reason why external validation is often a poor source of self-worth, we think it's often quite in tension with your need to build boundaries, right? Like boundaries and your ability to say no is very much a self-generated process, right? And this is really, really important, in particular for a set of people who often require the help of self-help narratives, which is to say addicts, right? People who struggle with addiction issues really need to say no, and it's really important that they build boundaries and have a sense of, have the ability to reject what their friends might want. But if that narrative isn't there and it doesn't give them a framework with which they can say, no, I need to set this boundary. No, I need to prioritize, my own health here. No, I can't do this. I can't do that. It becomes really hard for them to justify how they would set those boundaries. It becomes hard for them to even articulate the language of boundaries in and of itself, which is obviously quite a bad thing. The final reason we point out as to why external sources of validation are bad is that external sources of validation can conflict with each other, right? Like you can have external source of validation in your friends and external source of validation in your job or your parents, and those things can conflict. And if all you've been done your whole life is being driven by external validation, you have no sense of this is who I am, this is what I want, this is my sense of agency and purpose moving through the world, you get really confused and really distressed when you have two different conflicting sources of external validation pushing you in different directions. We think that in the absence of this narrative, you're just more likely to kind of, as a collective, we're more likely to cede the social world to those who are capable of manipulating others and withholding validation in order to get things. And you're just more likely to see a world where people don't take stock, look at themselves and consider what they really want and how to move through the world with a greater degree of agency, instead of ping-ponging between all the different sources of external validation that might exist in their lives. In fact, it's a really important part of growing up, we would argue, is like when you get a bit older, you learn that you can't just run around, do what your parents want, do what your schools want, etc. You actually have to develop your own beliefs about who you are and who you want to be, and then act upon those. All right, second argument, even if it weren't true that lots of people needed the self-validation narrative, why is it good to have a diversity of narratives? So the first thing to point out here is people are obviously quite different, right? People have different beliefs, different values, different backgrounds, and they interact with self-help narratives at different stages in their life. So it's quite likely that maybe, yes, you need a variety of different possible narratives that you can pick and choose from. Here's why there are a lot of options. The first thing we point out is the well-being industry and the type of people who create these narratives and profit from them. There's quite a lot of them. It's quite a well-developed industry now. It's been going on for a couple of decades. We would point out that there are large market incentives to diversify, right? You hear a whole range of different self-help narratives that exist, and that's because each individual, self-help provider needs to diversify and make themselves stand out from others. And also social media increases the access towards a whole different range of narratives. And that means it's really easy for people to pick and choose between narratives that work for them, and it's really easy for them to understand what narratives meant what. And it's really easy for them to kind of like sort of pick one that works really well for them. And this side affirmative was just deprive people of an option. Even if it only helps some people, it might help them a fair bit. It doesn't really harm anyone else. You can easily opt out of it. And therefore, for that reason, for the second time, we take.
Cool. I thank the speaker for their speech and welcome for the second affirming speaker.
Hello, I'm just checking that I'm clearly audible.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. I'll get started in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to do 3 things in this speech. I'm firstly going to start with just a characterization of the best and worst cases in this debate and explain why both fall towards the side affirmative. Then I'm going to talk in more general terms about how this kind of self-help narrative changes people's perceptions of themselves, and then thirdly, how it changes people's perceptions of others. First, to just some characterization of the best and worst case, because I think this is quite helpful in this debate, because affirmative is able to claim the very, very bad case of people who get sucked into, for example, men's rights activism. But I think we are also able to win on the kind of characterization that negative wants to buy into. So what does this narrative look like for example, a vulnerable person who seeks validation in an unhealthy way and might be judged unfairly by society and shouldn't necessarily take that judgment seriously? I think there are 4 ways in which this person is still harmed by this particular narrative. Firstly, you need to ask whether a person who is particularly vulnerable, who is pre-existingly mentally ill, is able to internalize this narrative effectively. And we tell you at Arin, to no response, that it is likely that people who have a predisposition to distrusting others, to low self-esteem, interpret this in a way that means when other people compliment them, when other people reassure them in their self-doubts, that they do not trust those people, that they are overly negative. So I think that we need to hear engagement from side negative as to why these individuals who might theoretically benefit from this narrative are functionally able to tap into those benefits. The second reason why this person is still harmed is that it likely makes it harder for them to break bad patterns. patterns. Because an unfortunate fact of things like mental illness and things like addiction is that you get into toxic cycles. You, for example, self-sabotage, and you do not realize that you are in those cycles. What you require is someone to come in and help you to realize that you are doing something which is toxic, but that critique in the short run feels bad. And giving people a tool which legitimizes and justifies ignoring that advice, ignoring that critique, is really unhealthy, because it's important for people to be able to go, well, hang on, maybe there's an element of truth there, and break that cycle at the point where they can go, no, that person is just judging me. Like I'm valid, I can do what I want. They're far less likely to be able to break out of those patterns of behaviors. Thirdly, we tell you to very little response that you probably need to learn to kind of care and manage about people's perceptions of you on some level, because those things are often essential, for example, social success or succeeding in your career. And it is often deeply frustrating when you try your best, but you cannot progress in life because other people view you with doubts. Unfortunately, it is just the case that it is important to learn how to manage and adapt those things, and this narrative thwarts that. The final thing to say, though, is that these people often still needed validation because it is such a major and natural part of their lives, at which point they were likely to feel self-blame and frustration at the point where they could not achieve it. Overall, I think I really clearly showed why this stakeholder, who is a negative's best case stakeholder, is still likely harmed by this narrative. But what was the worst case? We tell you that there exists a regressive self-help culture which allows selfish and misogynistic people to use this narrative to justify hurting and defending others. They frame obligation to others as something which is oppressive. The only response we get from our opposition is, well, chauvinists are likely to exist on both houses of the debate. And this is true, of course, but it is far worse on side negative for the reason that this kind of psychobabble legitimizes that sentiment, and it makes people far more impervious to criticism for the reason that now you go like, oh, well, this woman is telling me that I'm being a misogynist, but I don't need to listen to it because, I don't need validation from others. I don't need to take that seriously. Uniquely, then, this is a barrier to changing those attitudes. The final thing I want to note here is the claim that we hear from First Negative about how there are many different options of narrative worsens this best case, worst case scenario, because we tell you that people who are pre-existingly selfish are much more likely to buy into this narrative in the first place, and therefore, the worst case is far more likely to occur than for people with self-esteem issues who are very dependent on validation to believe in the narrative and read these self-help books in the first instance. So we just get more worst cases anyway. All right, I think that characterization really clearly crystallizes why Affirmative remains ahead in this debate. I'm now going to explain what this narrative does to people's perceptions of themselves. Affirmative makes 4 key claims. 1, we tell you that this narrative is hinged fundamentally on a distrust of others. It tells you that people's perceptions of you are false, that people are trying to mislead you and be harmful to you. Secondly, we tell you that vulnerable people are already often suffering from things like low esteem and paranoia about others' intentions. So this preys on those feelings. Thirdly, we tell you that things then like insecurity and hopelessness cannot be effectively contradicted from outside sources. So for example, if I am very anxious and I feel, like I can't trust myself to make a decision, if I've internalized this narrative, I'm going to struggle to have a friend just say, no, you're not being crazy. Like this is fine. You're right. That is something which I am far less able to buy into at the point where I've been conditioned by this narrative to say, well, other people's validation shouldn't matter to me. I'm failing myself in some way by requiring that validation of that outside perspective. And finally, we tell you that social validation is often legitimate. It often rewards good behaviors. And, you probably should get some of that validation at the point where you make progress on your mental health. For example, this is often something which is good for people who are struggling. Negative makes 3 claims. 1, they tell us that there's some people who want validation too much. I've already engaged quite charitably about why those people still suffer. But additionally, I would just point out that other narratives can help you deal with things like rejection. For example, there are other heuristics for working out if you should listen to people's criticisms. There are other ways and other narratives about building self-esteem. We are not forced to defend literally believing every form of external validation ever. We're simply forced to defend, people taking it into account and valuing it on some level, not rejecting it out of hand. Secondly, they suggest that external validation is often unpredictable and unreasonable, so people should not put too much stock in it. We already proved at Arin that validation is good in a majority of cases because the people who you particularly weigh it from care about you and have incentives to give you good feedback on your behavior, to reward you when you do good things. But additionally, for things like beauty standards, those are often things which are very deeply internalized. So even if you haven't got people applying it to you, you likely still apply it to yourself, and you are particularly vulnerable to that at the point where it cannot be contradicted from external sources. The final thing they tell us is people are going to be confused because there are different narratives coming at them. This falls for the reason that obviously obviously some sources you believe more than others. For example, if a good adjudicator tells me I'm a good debater and a bad one tells me I'm a bad debater, I know which one I'm likely to believe more, but additionally, I probably have some established concept of my debating ability that allows me to adjudicate these claims. Again, we are not forced to believe every piece of validation out there. People can still be critical about these things, but it does seem good for me to be able to listen to adjudicators and take their feedback on. I hope that elucidates this claim a little bit more. All right, so that's how people see themselves. How do people now see others? Affirmative claims are as follows. 1, you view others with suspicion. I've already explained that. 2, this likely means you are less open to healthy interactions that reward good things and compliment you. And 3, you are less open to feedback and critique. And that's really bad, for example, if you're seeking therapy. The emergent effects are you likely treat others worse because you care about them less, and you have a worse life because it is harder for you to adapt to society at large. Next, only real claim in response to this is that there are some pernicious individuals who will likely exploit you or neg you and take advantage of you. I think that this is firstly contingent on the fact that people can do this lack of validation successfully. And I've already given you reasons to believe that people who are very vulnerable probably cannot apply this in a successful way. And I would note that the people who use this in an abusive way are often incredibly pernicious, incredibly sneaky about it. It is often very difficult to recognize when they are doing it, which I suspect means that these people would be affected on either side of the debate. Uniquely though, what we offer is other people outside of abusive relationships can step in and give people feedback on the kind of toxic cycles they are stuck in. That was what you were more likely to ignore under side negative, because you were told, like, I don't need to listen to their judgments on my relationship. I don't need to take their feedback seriously. I should trust my own judgment by these kind of narratives. So the most pernicious forms of exploitation probably stood under side negative. It was the other more healthy forms that you are now conditioned to ignore. At the end of this speech, I proved that the majority of feedback you get from society is often positive, is often compassionate, but that which is not likely exists on either side of the debate. It is good for people to get this feedback. It is good for people to learn to relate to society in a constructive way. So proud to affirm.
Cool. I thank the speaker for their speech and welcome forth the second negative speaker.
Hello, everybody. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Thank you. Start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, let's deal with the actual topic. The topic does not require us to defend rejecting every source of external validation that you ever come in contact with. It asks you to reduce your dependency on it. This narrative in self-help has no incentive to take on the characterization that the affirmative team gave it, because no psychologist would ever sell a book if it told people who have come up into being a grown-up adult through a system of parents who rewarded or punished their behavior through external validation, of schools whose grades taught them to be dependent on on external validation, of social media context in which external validation, number of likes, number of views pervades everyday society. They would never have a chance of selling a book, of booking a session, of getting a follower on their Instagram page if they made all of those people feel miserable about the way that they live their lives. Because importantly, the incentive of psychologists and people engaging in the wellness industry in this debate wasn't, as it was very poorly, asserted to be at first, affirmative, like, intrusive and aggressive and difficult to listen to. It was to make people feel supported and happy and like they were getting something from their money at every point of their development journey. And that was not contingent on them reaching an end goal. That's literally all you learn when you go to psychology school. That's literally all you learn from the feedback you get from your audience. So even if we don't rely on the fiat given to us in the motion, it is not in line with any actors' incentives in this debate to take on such a high burden in which you ask people to reject something that is intrinsically linked to their human nature, which is to engage with some degree of external validation. What we told you from the negative, importantly though, was that it has become too much, that society has created too much of a dependency of external validation for a lot of people who are then set up to fall when that external validation falls away at some point in their life. That in the age of social media and receiving at least 100 likes on your photo on Instagram or Facebook in order to feel like you don't have to delete it, that there needed to be a counter narrative that exists, that so that people that felt well suited to that narrative narrative could opt into it and find a way to have a better form of mental health that carried them through the changing malleability of their mental health throughout life. They told you a couple of other things on this characterization. They told you, look, it produces socially optimal behavior because it encourages you to do good things like give. We would posit that there are a lot of other incentives acting upon the actor in this debate. And unlike the, ridiculous characterization of the person who randomly comes out at threat of their personal safety because they hear of this narrative existing, that wasn't how it actually happened. Actors remain rational. They consider a variety of things that are important to them, which is like, 1, I need serotonin on this day. 2, I have a bunch of personal safety concerns. 3, I have the fact that I won't have any friends tomorrow if I act weirdly towards them. 4, I won't get a job if I don't participate in XYZ social convention. 5, if I don't ever donate to charity, I'm going to be viewed as selfish. I'm going to have, less friends. I'm going to have less social importance. All those things still act upon them. But where does this narrative actually take place? This narrative takes place when somebody who is reliant on external validation finds that it is gone. Like a solar panel that cannot generate electricity in the sun, it tells this person new ways that they can get serotonin so that they don't kill themselves or that they don't go into a mental health crisis if they go through a breakup. If the person they relied on for external validation dies, if their group of friends wakes up one day and decides that they are an evil person, that they bullied someone, that they no longer belong in that group, if they wear ugly shoes to school, or if they're Taylor Swift and suddenly one day they're cancelled, even though they're an excellent, amazing person, right? That's where this narrative acted in place. And it was important for the affirmative team to engage with that. And when Ellie tells you that look, the big Hail Mary for their case is that people can engage with external validation critically, we would argue that you actually can't engage with it as critically as they want on their side of the house in the absence of this narrative. Because while it was all well and good that people know that theoretically they shouldn't be depending on people for their self-worth and they should adjudicate these individual claims, they can't do that if they are literally depending on it for survival. Serotonin dictates where they get, that like literally what makes someone to get out of bed in the morning. And if they don't know other ways to access it, even if they know what that form of external validation is bad for them, even if they know that it is inhibiting their growth, even if they know that it is an abusive relationship that doesn't suit them anymore, they won't know how to get out of it because the chasm that faces them in the weeks that are yet to come, where they don't know how to validate themselves without anybody else's input, is so scary that they literally know they might die. And that was what they had to stand by on the other side of this debate. We have received so few responses to why this is a particularly useful form of self-help that I'm going to whip it very quickly. We told you 4 things. We told you that external validation is out of your control, that it can be based on your inherent traits, that it can be unpredictable. Secondly, we told you that it is dealt out in response to other people's likes, not yours. So it means that it's unlikely to be aligned with your interests, which means that it's more likely to be about giving things to other people than taking things for yourself, which meant that fourthly, it was intention with setting boundaries, which was one of the biggest tools for making mental health gains for a lot of the actors that they cared about on the affirmative side of this debate. Because for a lot of people with poor mental health, it was or addiction problems, it was so important to be able to set boundaries that allowed them to break cycles. But unfortunately, when you set that boundary up, you almost inevitably disappoint somebody. You disappoint the friend who pulled the slot machines for you. You disappointed the bartender who expected you to show up to the pub and said, are you staying for another round of drinks? If you were reliant on external validation and you didn't know a way that when you get home, you can go and cheer yourself up differently, you don't have the courage to say no and set that boundary. On to the point about how external validation leads you to bad behaviors. The responsive material here is about the rabbit hole of regressive behavior that you might get in our world. We think that firstly, it is not actually the central tenet of Jordan Peterson that you reject external validation. That was an assertion. But secondly, people looking for a community and looking for external validation about their beliefs actually worsens the types of communities of incels and Jordan Peterson fans that they were worried about in today's debate, because it meant that even if there was someone who didn't necessarily believe that all women are shit, if they learned that if they post that on a Reddit forum, they are more likely to get upvotes, a person who is dependent on external validation might engage in that behavior even though they don't believe in it, because they didn't know they could have done something different that afternoon instead, that they could have tended to a plant, that they could have gone for a run, that they could have said something nice to someone and given them a compliment, that they could have looked in the mirror and smiled at themselves and given themselves a compliment, run themselves a bubble bath. The fact that men don't get taught how to do these behaviors means they look look for approval from a generation of men who are significantly worse than them, which means they are more likely to fall into these rabbit holes. But we told you that it leads to a whole host of bad behaviors when you're too dependent on external validation. Firstly, it increases your dependency on existing relationships. So you stay in a relationship rather than facing a breakup, even if you want to, because those 2 weeks are so scary. Secondly, you depend on social media and changing yourself to gain validation on that platform. You may have wanted to post a certain type of content, but you learn as a Black creator that when you make white recipes on your TikTok, you get far more views and you get shown on more For You pages. So you change in order to receive that form of external validation. Thirdly, we told you that it leads to peer pressure and groupthink. Fourthly, it means that you don't stand up to things like bullying, especially against yourself. It means that when someone makes a fat joke about you, you laugh along instead of saying, hey, even though I know this is going to make you unhappy with me, I'm leaving because that was not okay and that was harming my mental health. And the reason we help those people not do those behaviors is because we create a form of education that is very accessible through social media and through the wellness trends and through psychology that teach you what different trauma responses look like, for example, thwarting responses, and how you can heal that childhood need that was unmet yourself, meaning that you aren't dependent on an external actor healing that trauma for you. So you can run yourself that nice bubble bath, you can engage in a psychology session, you can do a whole host of things. At the end of this debate, it wasn't true that everybody engaged in this in a very harmful way. People still have the same critical abilities that Ellie needed to claim in order for her case to stand. But importantly, we gave them an option that was so suitable in a world that would never point them in this direction on its own. We meant that they could look after themselves when other people didn't care about them, and it meant that we saved lives.
Cool. I thank the speaker for their speech and welcome for the third affirming speaker.
Hey, can I just check that I'm audible?
Yeah.
All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Side negative, a set of targeted individuals who live in a world that is out to get them. Basically, their core argument about why relying on the validation of other people is bad basically amounts to 2 claims. The first is that other people are really bad. They want you to have a gambling addiction. They want to exploit you. And the second claim is that you are good and you always know what's right. So when other people, try to make you do something, you know what's right, and so on. We think that both of these are wrong. Given that most people spend time around their friends and family and people whom they generally like and people whom they should probably trust, it's probably not surrounded by evil people, but also the sorts of people that this norm most resonates with are those people who probably most need to change their ways, those who do have really serious problems, those who do need to listen to those who love them, people who can actually offer them a way out rather than simply being listening to the sort of manosphere loonies, people like, Jimmy Rex or the Bull, who tell them to bunker down in their basement and tell them that they shouldn't listen to other people. They should instead pay, $500 to go to AlphaCon 2022. So 2 parts to this speech. First of all, on the actual case, and second of all, on the ideal case, which side affirmative wins. On the actual case, this is quite important because side negative basically says, well, there are a number of ways in which reliance on external validation is bad. The problem is that they don't do anything to actually solve any of this, and they don't show that, they don't show that people's actual reduction of their reliance actually works or anything. They fail in 3, and basically side negative tries to reduce their burden in a number of ways. They say, well, we don't need to support people being really radical and just trying to completely excise this reliance on external validation at all. But the problem is that this is actually how it manifests in the real world. They say, well, no self-respecting psychologist would ever publish a book on that. Luckily, none of these books are published by self-respecting psychologists, but also, given the books that are the most radical are the ones that sell the most, and also, even if this isn't how the books are taken, the fact that these books are read by people who are desperate, are people who want to do anything to get out of their current situation. These are people who are going to apply any advice, even if it is recommended to apply it in moderation, are going to apply it to an extreme level. So what are the problems with this? First of all, it comes as a package of, it comes with a regressive package of norms. That is things like rugged individualism. That is things like masculinity. It says that, you should be a strong man who can stand on your own, someone who does not need the validation of women, someone who does not need to earn the respect of women. So that means that if you please yourself by, basically treading all over other people, that is completely all right because you don't need society to tell you you're doing the right thing. You can simply do what you want. And this has severe harms, came out down the bench, got no response, well, I guess that's side negative's problem. The second way in which things are bad in the actual world is that people fail at extirpating this need for validation or even slightly reducing it. And that is basically for reasons that side negative supplies. They say, well, this reliance on other people is so inculcated with you, not only by like, I don't know, human nature and your DNA, but by every single part of your upbringing. So given that we are probably talking about people who are rather weak-willed and who are rather vulnerable and people who are liable to blame themselves, it is likely that they're going to fail to do this. They are still going to feel bad when they get rejected by other people. And now what happens is not only do they feel bad, on top of that, they feel that this is an exhibition of their own personal failure, rather than, for instance, more likely on our side is saying, well, this person's opinion shouldn't matter and so on. So people still want validation, whether it be from themselves or validation in the eyes of certain norms like masculinity or whatever. So it's not like they get their success case. They only defend this narrative existing in society. And given that people apply this in really bad ways, that is a win for side affirmative. So to the extent they say it's like, oh, well, the problem is people's need for external validation means that they stay in really abusive relationships. Well, that's also side negative's problem, because these people who are in these abusive relationships probably aren't able to reduce their reliance on the other person, even though they almost certainly want to. And for instance, and then the third way in which this goes wrong for side negative is basically that the only people who really opt into this narrative are people for whom that narrative is beneficial. And that means, for instance, people who are just like naturally selfish and want to justify those things to themselves. And that means it's really, really bad. So side negative can't just say, well, sometimes this reliance on external validation is bad. They have to defend the narratives, the way these narratives are presented, the way these narratives are interpreted, all of which fare pretty well for side affirmative. So let's move on to the second part of this speech on the ideal case. So let's imagine that this narrative is being spread by qualified psychologists. It is being, dissected and analyzed and applied by people who are for some reason perfectly sane and rational, people whose views of the world aren't at all distorted. We think this is horrific. And that is basically, this norm is built on mistrust of others and pessimism, because why should you want to reduce your reliance on other people? It is to insulate against risk, that is, to constantly be on guard against all of the ways in which things might go wrong. This is like literally how it's presented in almost every single Stoic text and so on. This has two particularly nasty side effects. The first is that you are far, far less likely to seek help. And if you do get that, you are far less likely to engage with that help, because it says you don't need the validation of other people. Whereas if you have a close friend whose validation you rely on, who says you have a really serious gambling problem, maybe because they are your friend and they are a good person who cares about you, they are someone who isn't in the grip of this addiction, they are someone who can see things a bit more clearly than you are far more likely to listen to them. And if you are, for instance, to go and see a psychologist or a shrink or whatever, you are far more likely to be able to open yourself up to that person, because you aren't constantly on guard, or you aren't constantly thinking like, what does it matter what this idiot thinks about me or whatever. But second of all, you are far less able simply to enjoy life. And consider this, like the arch example of someone who espouses this norm is Marcus Aurelius, who writes that every time he would kiss his son goodnight, he would remind himself that one day his son would die. And that sort of thing, where you're constantly thinking about the ways that things could go wrong, constantly thinking about the way in which your marriage could go apart, you could lose your children and lose everything you ever wanted to get in life, that means you aren't able to be as close to your friends. You need to be able to show some vulnerability to people. You need to be able to have some confidence in those around you in order to live a meaningful life, one in which, your recovery from the worst of times can turn into the best of times. So, and this also responds, I think, to side negative's push that's like, well, some people just get no validation. Because I think it's almost always the case that someone has at least one person in the world they like, one person to whom they should actually look. But also, we think on side negative, if you don't rely on anyone and you're constantly skeptical of other people, you are less likely to actually go out and try and seek those sorts of friendships that you actually could obtain on side affirmative. So on side affirmative, you're more likely to get help. And once you get help, you're actually able to live a meaningful life, rather than one in which you're constantly on guard against something that is probably not going to happen. Side negative basically says, well, the ideal case for them is really good because you can break free of the social need for validation. And they say, first of all, this need for validation is bad because it is outside your control. But like, so too is everything, right? Like, I think at the end of the day, everything's outside of your control. It's sort of caused by something that happened prior to it. And there's nothing wrong with things being outside of your control. You're far better off just like, just copying it and being able, like, just learning things like resilience, rather than simply like excising every single care that you have for other people. And so what that means is, you're better off just like actually caring about things, maybe copying the lows, but that means you also get the highs. The second thing they say is that you can be exploited out of your need for validation. I think this rarely happens, but also it's the result of caring about anything. For instance, the fact that I love my mum can probably be used against me because someone could kidnap my mum or something like that. That's not a reason against loving her. That's a reason for I don't know, it's not a reason for anything. So at the end of this debate, they failed to prove that the ideal case of this norm in the very most abstract setting is at all good, but also they need to engage with reality, the reality in which it is spread by bad people, received poorly and enacted poorly. And that's why side affirmative is so far ahead.
Yeah.
Cool. I thank the speaker for their speech and welcome forward the third negative speaker.
Thanks, Sam. Can you hear and see me?
Yep.
There are 5 unjustified and unproven assumptions that need to be true in order for side affirmative's case to stand in this debate. Let's go through them. The first one is they need this narrative to be extremely powerful because all of their examples are very extreme. So they need this narrative to force you to really change the way that you operate, despite never explaining why reading a self-help book would radically change the way that you lived your life. The second thing that needed to be true was for there to be no countervailing forces. Despite what we tell you at first and second negative, that you grow up and are taught, for example, to seek external validation by your parents who punish and reward you with external validation, despite all the media narratives about caring about what others think, despite all of the things that everyone in society tells you to care about. The third thing that they needed to be true was a weird double standard, where Ellie, for example, tells you that, well, seeking validation isn't a problem because you can get different people's opinions, you can critically assess what people tell you, and then you can determine whether or not they are good for you or not. But apparently on our side, you can engage in none of that critical thinking. You can engage in none of that seeking of different opinions. You must immediately dismiss all criticism. You must immediately assume you're always right. You must immediately ignore what everyone else tells you. The fourth, So I think those 3 things were never proven by them, but they required them to be true. And that was why their case had so little progression from first affirmative. They're literally repeating claims with no actual new responses to the rebuttal we give. And it's why Mark feels the need to start his speech by mischaracterizing our case and claiming that what we are saying is that you should assume that you're right, or that this narrative is about assuming you're right and others are wrong. No, it's assuming that you have value independent of what other people think. You don't need the support, the validation of others to be valuable. It's not assuming you're right. Obviously, people will still realize they're valuable. So with that sort of intro explanation as to why they must lose the debate because they failed to meet their own burden, I'm then going to explain the 2 ways that we win the debate. The first one, very simply, is just by explaining that this narrative is on net really good for everyone, and therefore we should not oppose it. The second is explaining why people are good at selecting into the narratives that are useful for them and selecting out of the ones that are not useful for them. So why is this narrative on net good? I just want to start by responding to the claims that they make on this particular issue. First thing they say is it will make you less open to criticism. I already explained in the introduction why that's not true. You will still obviously be capable of rational assessment of when criticism is probably legitimate and when it is people just attempting to force you to seek their validation and so on. You can probably think about, does that criticism ring true? How trusted is the source who's giving it? And engage in those sort of mechanisms to determine if you should listen to it or not. But secondly, we'd say the group of people who are so self-critical that they seek out self-help and want to improve themselves are probably not the group of people who have no time to listen to the criticism that others give them. Their second claim is that external validation is good because it guides you in productive ways, like it helps you fit in, get jobs, stay safe if you're a closeted queer person, and donate to charity. We provide a number of responses. Firstly, we say people will probably do these things anyway because they want to stay safe, they want to have jobs, and they want to not be murdered by homophobic bigots. So it's unclear why they needed this narrative in order to do so. But secondly, we say there are tons of countervailing narratives that tell you to fit in. Conformity is very easy to do. The whole educational system tells you to do it. Capitalism tells you to do it. There's no clear reason why you needed this norm. But thirdly, we tell you that even if that was not the case, external validation was a terrible guide to follow, right? Because it was often trying to sell you stuff. It was companies making you feel insecure, so you needed their validation, or you needed makeup to feel like you fit into beauty standards. It was things like people who were trying to boost their own social value by putting you down. It was people who were trying to exploit your need for validation by abusing you. They gave no reason why this was untrue. Fourthly, we explained that even in their very best scenario, where it is a good guide, that you run into a problem where different sources of external validation conflict. Like maybe your religion and your friends and your job all tell you that you ought to behave in different ways. Only when you had our narrative did you then have the self-confidence to adjudicate between them. They provided no mechanism as to how that was the case. Their next claim was to say that, well, in extreme cases, it'll be bad because you'll join MGTOW and become a Jordan Peterson fan. But Brendan responds all the way at first negative to no response when he points out that these are really insecure people who become Jordan Peterson fans, right? It's not because they don't care at all what anyone thinks. You don't join like a really weird alt-right cult because you don't care what people think. You do it because you really care what people think, because you feel insecure, you need to fit in, and you need validation. Leah further explains to you that the core of Jordan Peterson's philosophy is about belonging to your own like MGTOW community. It's not about not being in community or not caring. So if anything, it's far more likely on their side. Their final claim here is just on addicts, where they say you will reject your support networks, which means that you will have trouble pulling yourself out of addictions. But we say that that is implausible because the kinds of people who form your support network, your friends and your family, who are acting in your self-interest, are the people who, even if you are more critical and less open to what other people tell you, are the last people you'd ignore, right? Like maybe you'd ignore some people, but why would you ignore the people who you know care about you the most and who you know are acting in your own best interest? That seems very implausible. You still have some rationality in the way that this narrative works. We say the more plausible claim is that what happens is when you're addicted, you surround yourself with other addicts, right? You like, when you drink a lot, when you're an alcoholic, you have alcoholic friends and they reinforce your behavior. What is more important is actually having the self-confidence to say no. And that is only possible when you don't believe and are not beholden to external validation, when you have our narrative to assist you. That dismisses the sum set of claims that side affirmative makes as to why this narrative is bad. We then provide additional substantive that has not received a response yet as to why it is good. For example, explanations as to why you will never be able to access external validation in many instances. Like if you are ugly, you will always feel bad because you will never measure up to beauty standards. Ellie kind of tries to respond to this by saying, oh, well, people always feel bad, but obviously this argument scales and they refuse to acknowledge that. But secondly, we provide valuable substantive around things like a capacity to set boundaries and how that's the most important things for you to be able to develop a sense of self, for you to have healthy like mental self-esteem and to develop your own identity and so on. No explanations to how you feel confident to do any of those things on their side. And that wins us the debate for the first, like in the first sense, because we just explained this narrative is great and it would be great if it propagated more and more people had access to it. But even if you believed none of anything I've said so far, we win the debate in a second way by just explaining that the people who would be harmed by this narrative will not opt into it, and only the people who will be benefited will opt into it. Why is this the case? We give three very simple mechanisms here. One, people are different, have different values, interact well with different kinds of narratives, and are in different stages of their life. So they need different kinds of self-help narratives in order to assist themselves. Two, that there are a ton of options of self-help narratives out there because, for example, capitalism wants to generate lots of different ideas in order to sell them to you, because people who propagate and create them want to have niche markets so they can appeal to you, because it's a huge billion-dollar industry with lots of marketing that is likely to cater to lots of consumer preferences. And thirdly, we explain to you that that means that you have lots of choice and a capacity to select what's good for you. We point out that you're likely to try multiple forms of these narratives and self-help mechanisms, that it's very personal, so you're likely to have the freedom to do so without societal pressure, that it's normal for there to be lots of variety and for you to see if these things work before you settle on them. All of which explains that it's just unlikely that if you are the person who has not benefited by this narrative, if you already are sufficiently self-confident, you just won't opt into this. You might opt into another narrative that expresses the importance of external validation if that was what you needed. They provide one response to this, which is to say, no, only selfish people will self-select into your narrative because they want to justify being selfish. We say, one, there are many other ways to do this, so it's symmetric. But two, there are a very small group of people. They provide no response as to why in all the other circumstances this would not operate. Speaker, at the end of this debate, ask yourself the very simple question: was there any reason standing that led you to believe that you ought to oppose this narrative?
I thank the speaker for their speech and welcome forward the negative reply.
Can I be heard?
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to start. 3, 2, 1. 3 questions in this reply. The first question I'll ask is, who seeks self-help? We explain that most people throughout most points of their life often will turn to seek self-help. But importantly, the act of going to a self-help conference or picking up a self-help book involves an implicit admission that something is wrong in your life or something is wrong with you and that you need some kind of help. And that neatly explains why their harm of people becoming more aggressive and stop listening to criticism is unlikely to be a winning harm in this debate. And that's because the set of people who select into the self-help industry and that market are sufficiently self-critical because they decided that they needed help, they needed to improve, that it's unlikely that they would use this narrative to entirely inure themselves of criticism. It's unlikely they would engage with this narrative entirely, they would encounter this narrative and then totally transform who they were and how they responded to the critique of others. We go further, however, though, because we point out that problems of self-help are typically problems of agency. People have identified some kind of problem in their life or themselves, but struggle to deal with it, struggle to improve themselves. And the set of people who would benefit most from an increased ability to access their own agency are the same set of people who are over-reliant on the validation of others. They are the same set of people who are too insecure often a lot of the time, who go out and look for self-help because they think they need, or because they feel they are insufficient, that something is lacking for them. And that means it's quite unlikely they're going to be the set of people who are really, really self-confident and don't listen to criticism at all. And that neatly explains why that harm can't exist. So with that out of the way, let's move on to the second question is, given that framing, does this narrative of downplaying your reliance on external validation harm people? They say, well, it could harm addicts because it could lead addicts to reject support networks. We explain that's probably quite unlikely. And in fact, we counter-explain to no response that it's quite good for addicts to be able to, use narratives around, well, I need to stop listening, I need to stop relying only on what my friends think because I need to have the strength to set my own boundaries. But we also point out that there's an odd tension in the way that Affirmative frames this. Because if you listen to Affirmative at different points in their case, they'll say that this narrative is so powerful, it can overwhelm you entirely and lead you to reject all others. But at the same time, it's so weak, it's unlikely to ever really affect your behavior or your life. And that brings me to the other point here. They say that some people are quite unstable personally or mentally and may, take this narrative and run with it the wrong way. Maybe take this narrative and lean into it too much, start to reject validation altogether. We would point out that obviously these people exist under both sides of the debate, and they're quite likely to be the same set of people who might really push to be, in their world, might really pursue external validation, incredibly aggressively, I suppose, and constantly look for that validation, and therefore that harm is probably symmetric, right? Because it's honestly often quite embarrassing for those people. The third thing we point out, the third question in this reply is, can people pick and choose between narratives? Because even if it was the case that maybe sometimes this narrative was a bit harmful, or sometimes it wasn't exactly what people who needed self-help needed, that was less important if at least some people benefited and other people had the ability to opt in and out depending on whether they benefited. We explained to no response, there are a variety of market incentives that encourage people to differentiate, and there's a very low cost of transferring between narratives. They say, well, this might be used by selfish people. We point out that selfish people are just often some of the most needy people. They're often the ones who are very vocal about their different needs. And they're therefore quite likely to be able to justify their selfishness through the use of other narratives like, you don't understand me, or you don't understand my needs, you don't understand what I require. And all of that means that even if it were true that some selfish people use to enable it, the benefit that occurs to the vast majority of people who are at a low point in their lives, who need to take more agency, who need to stop being so reliant on the views and opinions of others from benefiting from this narrative. And it's for that reason, negative takes them around.
Cool. I thank the speaker for their speech and welcome forward the affirming reply speaker to close out the debate.
Hello, hello. Am I audible from back here?
Yeah.
Beautiful. Let me just get my timer up and then I'll start. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. There are two questions in this debate. The first is, how do self-help narratives that instruct us to reject external validation affect our mental health and ability to break out of self-destructive cycles? And the reason I'm starting here is because this is the fastest way to understand why side affirmative has won this debate. Because it is here where we explain a set of people most likely to opt into this narrative corresponds with the set of people most likely to have issues with self-help or issues with self-esteem, mental health, addictive personalities, or engage in vice activities, and rely on the idea of external validation to escape from those ideas. And we give a reason why this is true, which is that self-help is most often targeted and seeked out by these groups of people that tend to be more vulnerable in this debate. Side negative starts this clash with some non sequiturs. They first say, well, actually, this is a narrative which has been good for this group of people because it teaches them to set up boundaries, which we point out very early on that this is a completely different norm about boundary setting. It's kind of unclear how they're able to set up these boundaries from a norm of rejecting external validation, which was a hole in the case of side negative. But perhaps I think their strongest push when it comes to this clash in the debate was the idea that, well, even if it does help people escape self-destructive cycles or help with people's mental health, it is also bad because it means that you're more likely to be open up to abuse and exploitation. Here we gave a lengthy series of responses. That firstly, often there is a set of people for whom their abuse is not recognized. So even if they're able to internalize this norm and it is helpful to escape abuse, it is unlikely to be able to, for the people that are being abused and exploited, actually help them break out of those cycles. That secondly, we are able to show that getting validation from others allows you to be more social, seek out support networks, and engage in the sorts of behavior that allows you to get out of cycles of abuse and exploitation. Well, that thirdly, you still have to judge this point on a way up, because we give you a series of arguments right from the start of our case about how it gives you a serotonin hit, makes therapy more constructive, gives you support networks, none of which I think gets sufficient response from side negative. So if you were considering handing this debate to side negative based on the effects on the vulnerable people that have issues with mental health, reconsider, as we do substantial responsive work here. Second question in this reply then, why is it likely then that people are likely to interpret this norm in a way that turns them towards engaging in incredibly chauvinistic behavior? I'll note this is an independent way for side affirmative to win this debate, because it's here we explain people likely to act in ways which is racist, sexist, and a set of other different behavior types that also hurt people that are particularly vulnerable and have low social, that are part of social minority groups in this debate. I think that side negative strategy here is not to respond individually to the different mechanisms we get about why is a norm which is encouraged this chauvinistic behavior, because it is similar to ideas of rugged individualism, because it is used and weaponized by very masked self-help gurus like Jordan Peterson, who get millions of people filling out stadiums to listen to the narrative, or this set of other reasons we give you literally right from first affirmative. And instead repeat this single response that there are independent reasons why people turn to chauvinistic behavior, become a MGTOW or become an MRA. But notably, we also give a series of responses to this line of argument. Like for example, that this is a norm which makes people resistant to criticism of MGTOW and chauvinistic behavior, because they are likely to reject validation from others, and that bleeds into their ability to deal with the, how they escape from chauvinism and escape from these rabbit holes. Well, that secondly, this is clearly still not an argument that defeats the case we make about chauvinism, because providing independent reasons why people might engage into it clearly just does not defeat the mechanisms we give. Or that thirdly, the characterization they gave about why these people are very insecure seems to be a reason why they are also very likely to opt into this particular narrative. So at the end of this debate book, I think this is a negative team just suffers from a really heavy lack of responsiveness. We do entirely the opposite, and that's why we get ahead.
Cool. I thank the speaker for their speech and thank you all for that debate. I'm wondering, just given we're in the main. So first of all, thank you all for that debate. I think it was a fairly high quality debate and well done to both sides. And I also think it was quite a close debate, so well done. In terms of how I'll do this, I'll start with the result, and then I'll go through the reasons for my decision, and then you're welcome to get individual feedback at the end. So in terms of the result, the panel was unanimous. We gave this debate to the negative team. In terms of how I'm going to go through that, I'm going to start by discussing who opts into these narratives. Second, I'm going to discuss what is the impact, what is the extent of the impact of these narratives on people who buy into them. Third, who do you obtain validation from in each world, the affirmative team's world and the negative team's world? And then through that discussion, I will address the kind of key substantive material in the debate. Starting then with who opts into these narratives. From the affirmative team, we hear that essentially those who matter most in this debate are those who are vulnerable, those who need the most help. In essence, those are the people that we're most concerned with in the debate. They're the most important. And I will address their material about just the general benefits of external validation in the course of my OA though. But I think that was the main focus as a result. Cool. Sorry, I just got a message. Yeah, and then from the negative team, we heard that those who are accessing, sorry, I might just pause for a moment, sorry, as I've got to do the backup ballot, my bad. Cool. So as I was saying, from the negative team, we hear that those who are choosing to access these narratives are those who already want self-help. And because of that, I think this was relatively intuitive. I thought that it was indeed the case, two things essentially, that the debate revolved around the impact on those in need of help. And secondly, that it also revolved specifically around the subgroup of those people who are actively seeking out and accessing help. Now, just in terms of the implications of this for the general benefits of external validation, I think, in fact, sorry, I'll deal with that in a moment. Second question then, what is the extent of the impact of these narratives on people? From the affirmative team, we hear that these narratives are often implemented by people in practice to an extreme, to the point that they block out feedback from others, feedback which helps them combat harmful behaviors. However, in light of that kind of preliminary analysis from the negative team, that those who most buy into these narratives tend to be those who are already accessing help, I don't think this is necessarily particularly realistic. I think these are people who are acknowledging that they need help, and by choosing to access help, that indicates to me that they're not likely to completely block out any external input which might make them change for the better. Further, we hear from the negative team just that this narrative doesn't exist in a vacuum, and that means it's unlikely to be implemented to an extreme. In particular, they tell us and mechanize that there are many competing ideas and narratives of self-help, and people probably try various ones. Secondly, they tell you that you're probably likely to try multiple narratives and then choose what works for you rather than immediately jumping in and buying into narratives fully. And thirdly, that it's inherent that people just want some level of validation, so they probably don't shut it out entirely. So because of that, I think the overall debate was not about completely shutting out of external validation. Just moving now to those general benefits of external validation brought right at first staff in terms of serotonin and that material. I think in light of what I've discussed, this benefit was substantially reduced because this debate primarily therefore revolves around those seeking help and accessing help. So those general benefits in terms of serotonin probably don't, I suppose, outweigh the more specific benefits which relate to those who are accessing help in particular. But the second thing, though, is I think for most of the population, they're probably still going to be getting a large level of external validation. So it's not a massive shift. However, I should note that point on serotonin did lower the margins in the debate. Cool. Thirdly, and this is really the meat of the debate and the most contentious part, and that is, who do you obtain validation from in each world? Because that really determines whether validation is going to be a positive or negative influence on those who are in need of help and accessing help. From the affirmative team, we hear that without the narrative, that in the world where the narrative isn't present, you're likely to access validation from parents, from friends, from partners who are likely to validate you in constructive ways. From the negative team, in contrast, we hear that you're likely to access validation and get validation from the people dragging you down. For example, if you're a drug addict, from other drug addicts who probably reinforce your behavior, and that's harmful. And the negative team presents a benefit here in that when you change to their world, as a result, you no longer have that reinforcement. You're able to construct boundaries, and that means you're likely to change for the better. In terms of weighing those things up, I think it's probably true that you get validation from both of those groups. But I think in the cases where people are struggling, it is probably plausible, just weighing things up, that the worst influences are likely dominating in those cases. So I think more analysis was really needed here, and could have improved the debate here and maybe changed the margin in the debate. Yeah. That meant that at that point, the negative team did get some degree of benefit in that when you change to your world, you're therefore it means you're now able to construct those boundaries. Secondly, though, what do we hear from the affirmative team about the world in which the narrative is present? We hear that in this world, people are far more inclined to buy into groups that do things like promote rugged individualism, hypermasculine culture, the MGTOW movement, those types of things. In contrast, the negative team tells us that these groups actually tend to involve and draw in people who want validation because they provide a community for that validation. And I think that was illustrated in particular at Second Neg. As a result, it is argued that this narrative actually makes things better because those people who are in desperate need of validation who might go into these groups choose or no longer feel that need, no longer do that. I think because of that, the negative team probably gets a marginal benefit there. I think the affirmative team would have needed to do a bit more work, I think, to just link those rugged individualism, MGTOW type movements to the narratives itself. Then in terms of the negative team's material about their world where the narrative is present, they tell us that partners, friends are likely to validate you in constructive ways and help you break out of cycles. I think in general, some more analysis would have been good about why you're likely to continue getting validation from those groups rather than those who are dragging you down in the past, when you're reducing your level of validation but not doing it entirely. And again, that was something that perhaps lowered the margin in the debate somewhat, and there could have been more explanation. But ultimately, I think I did buy the end of the debate and did buy that as a result, the negative team's world probably looks better for these people in need of help. Because of that, I think Neg wins. Sorry, that was messy, particularly at the start. First time I've forgotten to do the backup ballot, sorry.
That's okay, we understand and we appreciate your OA. Can't wait to reach out for feedback, and thanks for paying such careful attention to a late debate in the day. And thanks, Cindy, as well, for great debate.